Hello, today we are going to take a look at some LEQ questions and how I would approach these if this were an exam. So, what we will have is an option of 3 questions and 40 minutes when you go to take the AP exam. And the 3 questions are going to be from different time periods. Typically, one will be from periods 1 through 3, one will be in our middle periods, and then one will be towards the later periods. So a lot of the focus is more on some of the middle periods, so less so like periods 1 and 9 especially. So here we have 3 different questions. We've got one evaluating the extent to which the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, marked a turning point in American relations with Great Britain, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period before the war to the period after it. Then we have discussing the impact of territorial expansion on national unity between 1800 and 1850, and evaluating the extent to which the Gilded Age economy fostered change in the United States in the period from 1870 to 1900. So what you need to do is kind of quickly pick which question you would like to do. I'm going to walk through some information that we could use for all 3 of these, but on the exam, you're only picking one. And what I would do is just think about which one you know the best, or which one you have the best ideas of how to answer the question, even if you maybe know more information about, say, the or like the colonial period, but you don't necessarily know how you would answer that question right away. And it jumps to you as like, all right, well, territorial expansion, nice. That's pretty easy. I know how to answer that. But we need to just make sure that we are constructing a clear argument with this. So, what I would do is, if I were picking between these 3 questions, I would probably do, personally, the impact of territorial expansion, or maybe the Gilded Age economy. Because if we take a look at like the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War question, so we go through and we list out exactly what we would like, everything we know about this, and then we can kind of synthesize this into, all right, cool, here's the thesis that we could write, here are some of the paragraphs we could have, and then write from there. We are not going to write a full essay here, but we are going to go through each of these and how I would organize this. So what we want to talk about is some things that are prior to the war, after the war, and remember with the rubric, hold on, let me bring that up now. So remember, with our LEQ, we've got 6 points that we can get. 1 point for a thesis, 1 point for contextualization. We'll talk about appropriate ones for each of these questions in a minute. 2 points for evidence, and the important thing is that you are supporting your argument with this and not just saying, here's some stuff about the French and Indian War and before and after. Make an argument and support it. It's the difference between saying chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream is the best because of X, Y, and Z, and cookie dough ice cream has cookie dough pieces in it. I like cookie dough ice cream. Like, those are just statements, those are true things, but they're not supporting an argument. And like our thesis, although some people like mint chocolate chip ice cream better, chocolate chip cookie dough is the best because of X, Y, and Z. Then your analysis and reasoning, you're looking at comparison, causation, continuity, and change, and you are answering the prompt and going into more detail with that, looking at nuances, looking at similarities and differences, and so on. So those are our 4 points here, or 4 different areas to earn our 6 points. So as we're going through this, we can't just talk about, here's what's going on before the war, here's what's going on after the war, and then stop. We have to look at what changed the same and what did not. So prior to the war, what are we looking at? It's we've got some colonial expansion, right? We can look at because the colonies are pushing westward a bit. We have conflict with Native Americans, and with this, you want to talk about some specifics there if you have them as well. Like you could even look at, I know it's a little before the French and Indian War, but if we're looking at like Bacon's Rebellion is an example of like, hey, look, here's where there is a conflict with Native Americans, but then the governor is trying to stop it. So that's something that we can compare to other things. And then we really want to bring up the fact of salutary neglect, of that the British government is kind of hands off with the colonies. It's like, hey, yeah, pay your taxes that you're paying, but kind of leave us alone, or we'll leave you alone, as long as there's no issues here. So there's not a ton with those relations prior to the war. I mean, you can talk about the fact that some of the colonies are like royal colonies, just that they are directly under the control, but then some are, run by companies and such. So it's not a big thing, but it's there. So then after the war, this is where we're looking at a more hands-on rule, and we want to look at taxes, and this is where we start throwing out Stamp Act, Tea Act, and things like that are a direct cause of the war. So we need to make sure we bring the war into that. Another thing that we would want to bring up as a comparison is our proclamation line of 1763, because we can compare that to what's going on like with Bacon's Rebellion, where we have a conflict that the government is trying to stop. Like we've got the government on one side saying, hey, maybe we should stop advancing onto Native American lands, and then the colonists going, no, we want to. And that's where a conflict comes between, the people in the government and the colonists and the Native Americans. So this is one that, like, especially with some of the earlier or later time periods, we don't necessarily have things that show up quite as much here, because there's a lot of like comparison that we want to do in the middle time periods. And if it's one that like doesn't speak to you as much, or if it's especially earlier in the year stuff where it's like, oh, I know we reviewed this, but that was also a while ago. This is why I would kind of, me personally, avoid this question, because sure, we've got some information, but it doesn't feel as strong as what we could do afterwards. So I'd want you to spend about 5 minutes of like outlining before you start writing. So the way that I would take a look at this, I'd look at, well, I wouldn't want to just do like, here's an intro paragraph with a thesis, here's how it's the same, here's how it's different. I want to break it down thematically. So I'd start out with have a paragraph on like governing, relationship with the crown, something where you talk about mostly differences, but then there are still some royal governments or like royal governors and such. So that's having that nuance of like, yes, this is a difference, but it's not a complete difference here. There's a little bit of similarity. Then I talk about like expansion and so that issue is very tied together of this issue of expansion and a relationship with Native Americans, where like this is mostly a similarity. So we also could include Pontiac's rebellion in our discussion here, right, as like that push for the proclamation line. So that's really a big similarity of like, hey, look, it's still, coming down from Britain of trying to avoid conflict with Native Americans and try and stop the colonists from just moving westward as much as they want. And then have paragraph talking a little bit about economics. So like look at like, yes, there was some trading, some taxes, whatever prior to the war, but then after the war, we have all of these taxes, we have all of these acts. We like prior to the war, we can talk about like you still have like the navigation acts previously to try and like keep the trade in, but there's not as many like super direct taxes like there are after. So for the thesis, what I would say is something along the lines of, although there were similarities, between how the British government attempted to reduce conflict between the colonists and Native Americans, the 7 Years' War, and you'd write it out, but I'm just doing it for time's sake. 7 Years' War in the influence of the British government on the end of salutary neglect and the increase in direct taxes on the colonists. Okay, so like that's just my initial one, and you can always like clean it up a little bit later. But you have to have some amount of like, hey, we have some specifics of what's going on previously and after with our similarities and differences. So it's not as just like, here are the similarities, here are the differences, go into here. It could be 2 sentences if you want. some things for contextualization. Like this one, you really want to look at like formation of the colonies, especially, and talk about like the differences in governments, that some were set up directly from the crown, like Georgia, and then others were founded by joint stock companies, like Virginia, because then that's saying like, hey, I understand things later on, and then or that brought to this before this time period, and then this influences later. And you can also talk about relationships with Native Americans, but this is kind of how I would do this one. I feel like that's an okay answer, but I don't think I would be able to do as good a job as I would with some of the later questions. So let's start taking a look at the impact of territorial expansion on national unity between 1800 and 1850. All right. What I want to do here, let's talk about contextualization first. And remember, contextualization, when it's talking about this, a broader historical context, so that occurred before, during, or after. All right, great. Our after one is easy because we've got Civil War. Like, all right, well, like this is going to have some big issues for national unity later on. That the Civil War will end up happening. These issues will cause problems in, like, look at Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that can be kind of like at the end when you're talking about like, hey, these policies that between 1800 and 1850 that start to fracture national unity really like come to a head after 1850, with all of these things, when things get violent and then eventually break into a civil war. Previously, you can also talk about there's not as much of an issue here, but you can talk about like the Northwest Ordinance, as far as like, all right, well, this is a way that it was handled, like expansion was handled without conflict here. So some easy contextualization for this problem. We also want to just go into like, all right, let's start writing down everything we know about territorial expansion, but pay attention to dates. So I want to start off with the earliest time frame. We've got Louisiana Purchase. Okay. And what we're talking about here, like, we've got constitutional questions. It doesn't end up like right then and there being shown as like, hey, this is a big problem for national unity, but it's more like between parties of like, well, is this okay? Is this constitutional? What's going on? So we can look at War of 1812. Even though that's not territorial expansion, we've got like a possible breakdown of unity if we're talking about the Hartford Convention. Okay, just nice to note there if you're trying to track how national unity changes. Missouri Compromise. We want to talk about that as like our big like first kind of compromise and balance to explicitly say like, hey, look, we need to do this to foster national unity, even though it's very sectional in cause of like the North gets this, the South gets this, okay. And we can connect that back to the Louisiana Purchase as far as like that's where the land came from. So you got Missouri Compromise. You can look at the era of good feelings for national unity, of saying like, well, it's called the era of good feelings. We've got like essentially one political party, and so there is some national unity there. So if we're tracking unity, it's like kind of there for a bit and then starts to break apart, and then after 1850, like, yeah, things explode in here. So territorial expansion, you can talk about to have a more nuanced essay here. Like a growth of sectionalism, and you can talk about things like conflicts between like East and West as far as over some like governmental procedures. It's not just fracturing of national unity because of North-South and the slavery issue at this time. We can also look at, like, especially during Jackson's presidency, looking at East versus West, and you can talk about the National Bank. You can talk about things like, well, yeah, the tariff of abominations, not so. So talk about the tariffs, as long as you're saying that, like, hey, we know that this isn't specifically territorial expansion, but because of that expansion, like, we have very different mindsets about how governmental policy should run with East versus West. Some other things we have in here. We've got the Mexican-American War in this time period. So, because that's, 46 to 48. And really we've just got the question of slavery in the new territory, and like causes a lot of conflict here. And we can even talk about the, helps if I can spell it, the Wilmot Proviso of the, like, hey, maybe we should not allow slavery in these territories, and then that gets shot down. So then our last piece that causes, in the time frame that deals with territorial expansion, deals with this issue of national unity, is Compromise of 1850. And the thing is, we need to just connect it to this idea of national unity. And even though it's a compromise, it deals with territory from expansion, and then shows a breakdown of national unity, because, like, we can just talk about those outcomes of, like, the South gets really mad that, oh, look, the government is or the Senate's not balanced anymore between slave and free states. And then the Fugitive Slave Act, like, that causes some issues in the North. So that's really kind of like one of the last few nails in the coffin of national unity in the 1800s. How I would organize this. Will come in a second part of a video. Thanks for watching.